Hello, welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We have already spoken about consumption in the last lecture, and I had said that we would be discussing consumption within cultural studies as it is studied under that rubric over 2 lectures, right. This is module 3, which is entitled Sites, and today we are in the 9th lecture in this module. As always, let us do a recap of the last lecture. In the last lecture, we found that according to sociologists, according to cultural studies scholars, consumption, which is a part of our lives and which needs to be studied as a part of our cultural practices and forms, was studied initially under sociology from the point of view of, let us look at this slide here, from the point of view of social deprivation, poverty and its consequences, and policies on consumption to do with the alleviation of deprivation and poverty. Slowly we saw that there was what some critics term as a further sophistication or a refinement in the study of consumption, where we find in a second phase there is a refinement in or you say more subtle propositions on consumption from the point of view of terms like lifestyle, okay, like social position, and at the same time there was empirical exploration of the phenomenon of consumption. Then we found that there was a cultural turn even after these first 2 phases, a cultural turn which had a multidisciplinary approach, which was post utilitarian and which focus, like most cultural analysis do, on semiotic systems, okay, on the signs and signifying practices within the phenomenon of consumption. This was seen as related to postmodernism, in which the analysis was not an analysis that you would find from a Marxist perspective, for instance, with a clear onus on political economy. It was more about the signifying practices, images, symbols, signs, okay, to do with the consumption process, and as it says here in this slide, the experiential, aesthetic and emotional aspects of consumption, right. So, then we also found that Roland Barthes talks about the function of objects even within consumption practices as related to semiotic systems. Well, we will now continue with our discussion on consumption, but in this second lecture on consumption, the difference from the first lecture is this, the sense that we have dwelt upon the development of how theorizing has developed, changed, okay, over many years as far as consumption studies is concerned. We also looked at what is entailed in the cultural, theoretically, what are the changes in the cultural studies exploration of consumption. And today we are going to look in a bit to show you how this is done. And not to remain only at an abstract or theoretical level. Today we are going to show you how one aspect that of consumption, that is the process of eating out, okay, which falls under the general rubric of food studies, right. What goes into this phenomenon called eating out? Is it simply a choice that we make of not eating in the house, simply a choice, or what goes into the choices, okay, that we make as, and what is the cultural experience, right, the aesthetic experience, even the political aspects of eating out, right. So, we have a change in the text obviously here, and the key source texts in this lecture are Joan Finkelstein. Finkelstein is a very well known name in food studies, particularly in studying as far as studying eating out and the restaurant experience is concerned. Okay. Then we also refer to Gabriel and Lang's The Unmanageable Consumer, and Ward and Martin's Eating Out, Social Differentiation, Consumption and Pleasure. Let me say at the outset that even though these books are obviously they look like they are from sociology, but we will be looking at it from a cultural studies perspective. Fine. The first point that we would like to discuss, and has been mentioned by the critics, talking about the sociology of eating out, the cultural studies of eating out, is this. Please look at this slide. The paradoxical nature of eating out as a cultural practice. Now, if you look at in an untheorized sort of way at the practice of eating out, one of the first things that comes to our mind is definitely this, that eating out, going to restaurants or eating in malls, etc., is a very pleasurable exercise. Okay, as a practice, as a cultural practice, it is definitely one that is saturated, okay, or filled with pleasure. Otherwise, why should one go eat out at all, right? But this is how you go about theorizing a seemingly simple practice like like eating out. We say that this phenomenon has a paradoxical aspect to it, or it is paradoxical in nature, right? One, of course, there is a sense of pleasure in eating out, and as I had said, why would we go out, why would we step out of our homes to eat if it didn't give us pleasure? There is a sense definitely we have of choice, right? We choose to eat out, sense of power and even identity formation, right? The places where you choose to go to eat out. For instance, if you go to McDonald's or if you go to Domino's, for instance, right? So you have a sense of identity being formed. You belong to a certain group, social group, for instance, or if you are young, then you identify with all the young people that hang out in such such places of eating out. And there is also freedom that is performative. If you observe people in these places, you will find that there is a certain performance that is being played out. One simply doesn't go and consume the food and come back. Okay? So, this performance and this freedom is definitely related to identity formation, and as they want their identities to be to be perceived by people, okay, people perform that act which they think is one of freedom and choice, right, in such places. But we shall argue eventually that it is not as simple. There is not a practice where it is completely willed by you, or that you choose to make these performative acts. So, what does the paradox entail? The paradox entails this, that there is, along with these three things that we looked at, there is also an element of pretense, right? It is but natural that in this performance and freedom and identity formation, there will definitely, okay, will be an because there is a performance element here, right? So, there will be a sense of pretense. Next, there is actually where we find, when you think, one thinks that there is a sense of choice, right, there is actually a lack of choice and power. So, this is how critics say that at the same time as you feel that there is a sense of power and sense of choice and freedom, actually there is also the opposite, which is a lack of choice, right. There is a pretense, and the performance is not one of performative freedom, but of simulated performance. Okay. So, you see how right away I think we have already problematize this seemingly simple practice of eating out. From a cultural studies perspective, eating out, as has been shown by scholars like Finkelstein and others, it is a paradoxical exercise, or it is rather paradoxical in nature. Well, so let us see what are the areas, okay, what is entailed in a study, in a cultural studies analysis of food and practices associated with food. Okay. To delineate the scope, let us look at this slide. To delineate the scope, we find that cultural studies and food, it's a wide spectrum, the scope is very wide, and unless you are familiar with it, one would be quite surprised as to how an everyday practice like food, like consumption, etc., okay, how these can be theorized very richly, okay, from from so many perspectives. And of course, a lot of work and a lot of study and research has gone into exploring food and consumption from these perspectives. For instance, number one, nationalism and diet is one, how identity formation as far as nationhood is concerned, even nationalism is concerned, is also related to practices of diet. Then globalization and multi-cuisine, with the coming in of globalization, how the variety, the diversity of food items has grown. Then food writing on food, whether it is food journalism or books on food or travelogues based or focus around food, right, is also another area of study. Eating in and eating out, and our we have chosen eating out to give you an idea of how to theorize a food practice. Consumption and taste, eating and identity, body, diet and health, disorders, anxieties and ethics, like for bulimia for instance, okay, eating disorders, anxieties, and matters to do with etiquette and socializing. Okay. So, you see here there is a very rich, right, there is a very rich area or there are very rich areas, very potentially very rich areas as far as studying cultural studies, food from a cultural studies point is concerned. So, if we found that scholars like Finkelstein and others point to the paradoxical nature, okay, of eating out, okay, on the other hand, there is also another aspect to it, which is one can do a cultural or several cultural analysis of an emerging habitus, and this word habitus you found, or we had occasion to look at it in the last lecture, in part 1 of consumption, and we find that there is an emerging habitus as far as cultural of eating out is concerned. For instance, there is this phenomenon called cultural omnivorism, which has been identified, so to speak, by scholars, okay, and there is they call it a post-traditionalist change that is post-traditionalist in nature, in the sense that if one is a cultural omnivore, right, what happens is obviously one leaves behind one's traditional diet that is associated with class, diet that is associated with, in India with caste, diet associated with one's even ethnic community, for instance. Okay. So, one crosses these borders and barriers, if I may use the word, of food, of consuming food, when one is not simply eating in, but particularly it seems like when one is eating out, then there is a tendency in people to break these barriers. Then it is also termed as a romantic turn and a postmodern turn in food practices. And finally, cultural analysis of this new habitus is of concerned with lifestyle, and importantly the impulse of other directedness, which is also related, as you will see, to cultural omnivorism, right. So, there is a lifestyle which is again, it does not kind of implode into oneself, one is looking outward and trying to also if not appropriate, at least experiment with the kind of lifestyle that is being led by people from outside one's community, caste or ethnic affiliation. So, this we use the word a certain adventurousness that is there, which is definitely a post traditionalist one that breaks away from tradition. So, you see how we can theorize, or how people like, or scholars like Finkelstein and others have very richly theorized this area on food consumption and eating out, for instance, okay, and have shown that how new cultural orientations, new cultural practices, for instance, emerge, which we call a habitus, a new habitus emerges as identity formation practices shift, as identity as desiring certain identities also shift with the coming in of globalization, right, where there is adventurousness also in practices relating to food and consumption. So, I hope we have been able to begin to see how this theorizing of food and eating out in particular is being done from a cultural studies perspective. Now, Gabriel and Lang in The Unmanageable Consumer, which is also one of our source texts, okay, point to what we call the foodie, okay, in general parlance, and in more formal terms we call the connoisseur, right. So, there is also the emerging personality, or the emerging the emerging persona, so to speak, of the foodie or the connoisseur, right, with changes in cultural practices, with eating out, for instance. One of the very clear examples, one of the very common and popular examples are these shows related to food that you have on television nowadays, okay, which are being hosted by these so called foodies and connoisseurs, who give you, it is not simply about food. If you look at it carefully, you will understand it is not simply about food, but it is to do with, let us look at these points here. These are the points that are concerned with the foodie and the connoisseur. The connoisseur or the foodie therefore is a chooser according to cultural theory. He or she is a communicator of not just food, but also of culture, is an identity seeker, is an explorer in the sense in which one can be an explorer of places. Okay. A foodie or a connoisseur is also an explorer of domains of food in different areas of the world, is also perhaps a hedonist in the sense of wanting to both experience and experiment with pleasure as far as food is concerned, okay, is an artist. At the same time, if you look at definitely the paradoxical nature, it may also be a victim of his or her own enterprise, is a rebel and is an activist and a citizen. So, well, next time you look or you happen to come across such programs on television, you look at it anew, you look at the program anew, and you look at the host or the food connoisseur anew, and you see in that persona so many different aspects. This is the way one does a cultural studies or cultural studies analysis of food and of the representation of food in the media. Now, eating out therefore is like many other cultural practices, right, there are certain there are certain relations, or there are certain parallels we can draw with other kinds of cultural practices. Okay. Like many cultural practices, therefore, if you look at this slide here, eating out, the phenomenon of eating out is really, these are structured events. Okay. On many in many times these are also social occasions. Okay. They are organized by rules. So, it is not this is where the paradox, or our realization of the paradoxical nature slowly begins to seep in, right. We had, we said a while ago that normally people conceive of the whole process and phenomenon of eating out as one that is imbued with power, with identity formation, one's willed performance, etc. But slowly we see that these are also structured events, right. For instance, they are organized, also organized like other cultural events and practices, or practices to do with food and things like eating out or going out on an invitation. These are also organized by rules, okay. And what are these? What are the delimitations? These are to do with the time, place, the sequence of actions that are to be followed, and the permitted combinations. So, like all social practices that are informed by rules, by certain norms, also the practice of eating out is informed and a very structured event. Okay. Then scholars like Finkelstein and others also say that, well, if you look at if you look at the if you look at food practices in general, we may divide them into a couple of aspects. Okay? And the first aspect that is brought to us is the cognitive aspect. Now, what is cognitive? What does it mean when we say cognitive? Cognitive, as you know, is to do with attention, is to do with memory, with perception and the like. Okay? So, also to do with food, therefore, there are cognitive aspects, for instance, aspects of health, right. There are aspects of calorie consumption, of vitamins, and also in food practice in general, of the convenience of preparing food, of different ways of preparation, of storage and ability. These are the cognitive aspects of food preparation. Then, apart from the cognitive, okay, there are also the affective aspects. Right. Now, it is not that affection or emotion is not to do with, many scholars would certainly say that cognition perhaps also from a certain point of view also involves affective aspects or aspects of emotions, right. So, in this however, we may make a subtle differentiation in the sense that there are sensory aspects to it. For instance, food has to be found appetizing, palatable, tasteful, and definitely we when one goes or when one eats out, these are some of the sensory delights that one looks forward to, or one at least expects when one is being served outside the house. These are that the food has to be appetizing, palatable and tasteful. Along with the sensory elements are also the purely emotional aspects of eating out, which is to do with friends, memories, okay, happy memories, and being with friends, a feeling of conviviality, right. So, we found that there are two aspects to it. We may divide them into cognitive aspects, okay, to do with things like our perception of health, our perception of one's perception of health, calories, vitamins, preparation, storage, etc., and one's affective aspects like whether the food or expectation of food, particularly when being served outside the one's home, is that food has to be palatable, well prepared, and to do with feelings, emotions and memories. Then, if we compare eating in and eating out as cultural practices, and from a cultural studies perspective, we find some interesting differences. Okay? As far as tradition is concerned, as far as the breaking of taboos is concerned, or the retaining of taboos is concerned. Now, in eating in, we find that there is, we may theorize it as a practice which maintains tradition, right. So, there is households or communities have their own idea about what good food is, okay, what clean food is, and what healthy food is, right. So, there is and accordingly there is a maintenance of tradition, particularly as food practices being the way they have been passed on from generation to generation. Then there is also a sense of stability of food choice. One doesn't really, it is expected that there is a certain regularity. Look at the words here, maintenance, right, stability. So, there is also certain regularity, if not predictability, of food practices when one is eating in. So, what are the first two that we found? Maintenance of tradition, stability of food choice. Third, the reassuring boundaries between members of the household and others. Okay, so, look at the words here really, maintenance, stability, reassuring. Then a retaining of identity and a reaffirmation of existing familial divisions of labor and power hierarchies. Okay. So, who is going to do the cooking, who is going to do the washing, and who is going to kind of supervise the cooking, for instance. These are these are reaffirmed day in and day out as food is prepared and consumed inside the house. Okay. So, really if you look at all these words are to do with stability, are to do with a resistance to change as far as food practices are concerned. There is also an attempt, if not a very overt one, but it is understood that these are attempts at identity retention. These are attempts at reaffirming the hitherto existing hierarchies in a particular family that has been there for some time, and of division of labor within a family, right. So, it is not that it is something that never changes. It is generally observed that division of labor, for instance, okay, as far as food preparation is concerned, is not really radically changed as far as eating in practices is concerned. Next, eating out. So, we looked at eating in, now we look at eating out. Now, eating out is usually perceived, okay, by cultural studies scholars and sociologists as hedonism or uncomplicated and immediate gratification. Right. This is one of the aspects. Okay. So, it is not by only, as we will see in a while, it is not by only means the only aspect that leads one or kind of motivates one to eat outside the house, but definitely an immediate and uncomplicated gratification of one's culinary desires is something that eating out serves the purpose, right. Second, there is also the convenience or release from drudgery. Definitely, there is for the person in the household who is always responsible for whether it is by supervision or whether it is by actually doing the work in the kitchen. There is also an aspect in which there is a break in the monotony and the break in the drudgery, the release in a temporary release in the drudgery from the drudgery of being in the kitchen. Third, it is a source, it is considered in cultural studies a source of sophisticated pleasure for the discriminating palate. Okay. So, where on the one hand it may be an act of simple gratification of one's culinary desires. In certain cases, this is also a practice practice in which one looks at eating out as a source of great pleasure and discriminating pleasure. For instance, discriminating in the sense of how well you can judge the food, the ingredients that go into the preparation. If it is something that is not within your usual daily pattern of consumption, if it is different, how do you then derive a certain sophisticated pleasure as you understand how a particular item has been prepared, which you are not used to, right. So, it is apart from straightforward hedonism and gratification. For some people, it is also an exercise, also an exercise of the palate that can discriminate among different kinds of tastes, right. Then conviviality. When one eats out, and particularly when we are talking about situations in which one is with family, sometimes with extended family, and with at times also with friends. Okay. So, it is also a platform, or it is also an arena for conviviality of socializing and exchanging pleasantries with one another. Then there is the overall experience of eating out, right. The overall, as we said, the aesthetic, the cognitive, the emotional, the identity forming, the overall experience of eating out is the the general kind of general umbrella that is there, and in different situations there may be difference in degrees, but generally it is the whole experience of eating out that we are supposed to look at, and particularly its various aspects. Okay. And the ambience, the atmosphere of eating out is also one that is amenable to cultural studies, but especially the the way the restaurant is laid out, the way it is built. It is a very rich text, if I may use the word, a very rich text which tells you so much about the symbols, okay, the signs and what they mean and how they relate to the actual practice of people eating in that restaurant. Okay. These are also very rich signification, processes of signification and signifying practices, where a well trained cultural scholar can draw very rich inferences from even the ambience of a restaurant. Okay. And of course, finally variety, right. Variety is also also another variable in these as we study the processes of eating out. So, let me quickly summarize, okay, where in the case of eating in, right, in cases of eating in, what did we see? We saw that there was whether you do it overtly or you don't realize that you are doing it, there is definitely it is a more tradition based exercise in the sense, or even if the tradition of a particular household, even if it is a kind of nuclear family, right. So, traditions are maintained, boundaries are maintained, work divisions, division of labor is maintained, okay, and borders of boundaries regarding one's community, caste, class, etc., are usually retained and reaffirmed in everyday practices of eating in. On the other hand, as far as eating out is concerned, it is considered a more exploratory, right, a more adventurous exercise, where and as we said, it was considered a post-traditionalist exercise, where traditions are sometimes deliberately broken. Okay, taboos also are deliberately broken, and it is seen not simply as regular routine based exercise as one eats. It is also seen as a scene, a scene of, or a platform for conviviality as one eats out with friends and family, and also the entire experience of eating out is also considered different, okay, as the variables are different, okay, different from the phenomenon of eating in. So, you see how seemingly practices that seemingly are nothing to do with academic study, for instance, once they come into the purview of cultural studies and other kindred domains like sociology, anthropology, etc., they offer a very rich interpretation and analysis of our everyday practices, right. Now, I will go to show you how scholars have tried to differentiate between the whole aspect of eating out, really, unless one is eating out on one's own, is definitely, you will agree, a social practice. Okay. So, social dining in pre-modern times was slightly different from in that we find in the modern times. Okay. So, as scholars like Finkelstein and others have pointed out, in pre-modern times definitely there was a relatively underdeveloped market, and social obligations were were very strong, and the transactions were non-commercial, hugely or to a large extent non-commercial in nature, with the realities of an underdeveloped market. There was a great importance on hospitality, on gifts and feasts, the sharing of food surpluses within members of a community. There was a virtual guarantee of food, okay, and the food practices were also, and particularly eating out, was also an expression of social solidarity. Okay. So, these are the points, okay, underdeveloped market, non-commercial nature of the transactions, the importance on feasts and gifts, sharing, guarantee of food, okay, expression of solidarity. These are the hallmarks of social dining, okay, or what we call eating out in pre-modern times, and we shall see how these are different from the modern times. So, again there was these again importantly in pre-modern times, it was a reciprocal obligation, and they are it marked the rites of passage as they are observed in different communities and cultures. But now we shall see that with the rise of the market, okay, something else happens. With the rise of the market, there is more individualism coming in, right, and there is also the breakdown of kinship obligations as families begin to break out of the joint family system and they have their own nuclear families, okay. The growth of urbanization, there is a breakdown of kinship obligations, there is also increase in travel, and with travel also there is also the increase in coffee houses. Okay. Importantly, if you compare this to pre-modern times, it is very important to note that coffee houses came about, and when we do social history find that coffee houses came about in say 18th century, late 17th century, 18th century England, okay, where we find even till today that there is it's an establishment that is anti-hierarchical in location and also anti-hierarchical in practice. For instance, anyone can go into a coffee house. Coffee houses are also, they are not, you do not expect huge feasts in coffee houses. Coffee houses are areas, places you go to for a short duration, for a short exchange of conviviality, for a short exchange of discussion, for instance, or short duration of participating in discussions. And the coffee house really is such an important marker, that we find as we move from pre-modern times to modern times. And also where in the modern times there was this great, it was a great obligation or a great transaction of giving feasts, for instance, of showing social solidarity, or even probably once hierarchy, and of guarantee of sharing of food supplies among members of community. We find here that eating out also becomes an act of necessity than only being an act of pleasure as we move on to modern times. So, these are the things that one needs to look not only at the experience of one of one or two events of phenomena of eating out, but generally also the historical development and changes in the practices and what they signify. Okay, for instance, in pre-modern times you would see that it would signify a feast would signify social solidarity, for instance, whereas today it may not do that all the time, and it was a traditional exercise and it was one where there was a marking of hierarchy. But today we find that particularly in the symbol or sign of the coffee house becomes a sign of an anti-hierarchical orientation in society. Then the study of eating out really, again, as Finkelstein and others have pointed out, this kind of eating out as far as modern times is concerned is really it is a phenomenon that is or an academic the academic study of eating out is really not one that has been done for several years, but it is a recent phenomenon. And early, again, like in the first lecture we saw that there are different phases of studying consumption. Here also in one consumption practice, that is of eating out, the early studies looked at nutritional aspects and they brought out market research reports, and there were campaigning books also. So, the early phase looked at these kind of studies, which was empirical in nature and which was utilitarian in nature. Now, if you look at Ward and Martin's book, in fact, the title of the book is Eating Out, Social Differentiation, Consumption and Pleasure. I am reading out from this and we shall unpack it, right. Eating out has serious implications for any comprehensive understanding of the nation's diet. Eating out throws into sharp relief narrow concerns with food as merely a means of subsistence, for eating out seems to be expanding as a form of entertainment. This is important, okay. Eating out seems to be expanding as a form of entertainment and a means to display taste, status and distinction. Also significant is the willingness of people to swap their private domestic food provisioning arrangements for commercial and communal alternatives. Okay. So, this becomes a very important word here, okay, for where the commercial aspect is foregrounded in contemporary practices of eating out. And what Ward and Martins have referred to is eating out is definitely not just one of necessity, as as one is in a nuclear family and one one eats more frequently outside. It really involves so much more than that, in the sense that it is also means to display taste. Look, remember the foodie or the connoisseur who can who has a discriminating palate and can and can give so many pronouncements and judgments on food of different cultures. Therefore, it is eating out is also a symbolic practice. Okay, this is a point that we need to look at very carefully if you are doing a cultural studies perspective of eating out. Eating out is an act and also involves acts of identity formation. Okay, it also involves acts of displaying one's taste, okay, status and distinction. Words that we found in the first lecture was coming from scholars and sociologists like Bourdieu, etc. Okay, the forming of, remember, an emerging habitus, a new emerging habitus, where one of the most important differences is the commercial aspect. Now, again, as Finkelstein and others have pointed out, I am quoting, food made available for money from commercial outlets such as shops, takeaways, fast food and other restaurants has been identified as a particularly 20th century revolution in our eating habits. Okay. So, if you look at the, if I may use the word, the grandiosity, okay, the grandiosity of social dining in the pre-modern times. Okay. In modern times, of course, we have social dining as as a platform for the display of social status, of the display of taste, distinction, etc. But as an important corollary and running parallelly to this is also, as first we saw the coffee house, member, where where it's not necessary that it is an environment for display. Okay, it is more an environment for food for thought, really. Okay, also the other. If that was a phenomenon beginning in the 18th century, today in the 20th century, the important places for eating out are things like the takeaways, as it says here, the commercial outlets such as shops, takeaways, fast food and other restaurants where you get quick food, right. So, this is a cultural practice which is definitely a 20th century practice, a 21st century practice, and is a recent addition to food studies. Okay. Now, the next term, and this is a term that I am sure many of you have come across, is McDonaldisation. And McDonaldisation of course refers to McDonald's, the very popular food outlet which you will find in so many parts of the world. Okay. So, scholars too, it is not just the media, but scholars too have used this term McDonaldisation to make some very important theoretical pronouncements, okay, on on food practices. For instance, McDonaldisation as a cultural studies person or as a sociologist would put it, involves, okay, can theorize it using terms like formal rationality. Okay. Formal rationality, there is a very efficient scientific, almost a scientific management of these kind of food outlets like for instance Domino's or McDonald's and KFC for instance. Okay. So, there is a formal rationality to it, it is a scientific management, it is almost assembly line, it is almost done in an assembly line format. Okay. The work performed there by people is almost on an assembly line format of mass production available in shopping centers, and also with such sort of hyper efficient, okay, management and such great formal rationality behind it. There is also a certain predictability. The predictability not only as you watch the workforce in such outlets, but there is also a predictability as far as the food that is doled out is concerned. So, you see again, as I said, these seemingly simple things like going out to eat in such places, okay, involves a totally different orientation as far as particularly when you compare it even to coffee houses or even to the pre-modern times, okay, where there is a hyper scientific management and assembly and a resultant predictability to it. So, the sites of such places in the 20th and 21st century are sports stadiums, health clubs, airports, bus and railway stations, museums and galleries, bookshops, supermarkets, cinema halls and malls. And all these places, you will notice one thing in common here is that you are not expected to spend much time in these places, whether they eateries in museums, bookshops or cinema halls, supermarkets, etc. Okay. Eating places for eating out that are attached to these places are always to do with speed, to this as speed as a hallmark of the modern times. Okay. So, you see as economies change, as economies open out, okay, as it becomes more globalized, there is diversity and variation everywhere, also affects the processes of food consumption and of particular practices like eating out. Okay. Therefore, the restaurant experience, as Finkelstein and others have pointed out, is a whole consumption package, right. So, we are coming to the close of this lecture, and we would like to wind up by saying that the entire restaurant experience is one which entails a variety of pleasures, okay, and with themed restaurants we also have occasion to to experience a certain themed or have certain themed experiences, right. And also it is a multisensory experience of taste, sight, sound, smell and touch. It is not to say that taste, sight, sound, smell and touch are not part of eating inside the household, but importantly these are far more heightened in the restaurant experience. Therefore, let me quote from Finkelstein: "The modern restaurant designs its decor, service and atmosphere in such a way as to relieve the customer of the responsibility to shape sociality." Why? Because it is already, it is already there for you. The template is already there. You do not have to work for it. It encourages simulated rather than genuine social engagement, and there is an obligation, again as we have come across this word before, to give a performance according to the normative demand of the circumstances. Therefore, if you thought that eating out is a eating out or eating in restaurants is an act of performance involving power choice, Finkelstein and others would say no. Because why? Because the format is already laid out. So, you may not even be genuine in where you are actually you think you are being convivial, you need not be genuine, because the circumstances determine, so to speak, the performance which you think that you are making or doing with so much of freedom, right. So, let us come to the discussion and we will quickly look at one or two questions. For instance, why is eating out considered a paradoxical practice? Eating out is considered paradoxical because it involves both pleasure, a sense of choice and power and performance, and at the same time it involves pretense, and where there is actually, we may argue, a lack of choice and power, since the performance is a simulated and a simulated one, where the parameters are being drawn by people, by other people and not by yourself. Then what aspects of food are considered under cultural studies? The aspects of food in cultural studies in a general sense may be nationalism and diet, globalization and multi-cuisine, food writing, eating in and eating out, which was our concern today, general theories on consumption and taste, eating and identity, identity formation, identity retaining, body, diet and health, disorders, a very important aspect here, disorders like bulimia for instance, anxieties to do with eating and diet and health and ethics and etiquette and socializing. Then what are the differentiating cultural aspects of eating in and eating out? We found that eating in is a traditionalist exercise, where we go on to the maintenance of tradition, maintenance of practices, of hierarchies, of power, of division of labor, on the reassuring practices which are reassuring by the sheer replicability and the sheer repeatedness, whereas eating out is also concerned with both immediate gratification as well as sophisticated pleasure from foodies or connoisseurs. It is also seen as however controlled by somebody else, a scene of conviviality, of performance, of exchange, of experience and ambience. Again, however, the paradox being how it is also being created by somebody else, and of variety, and definitely a release from drudgery, from the eating in framework of drudgery for those who are in charge of giving food to the family members. So, thank you for being here, and I hope I have been able to show you how eating, a practice like eating out of your house is so infused or it's infused with so much so many aspects to do with aspects of power, of pleasure, of signs, symbols, right, of constructedness. Even the eating out process phenomenon is one that has been constructed, within which we try to exercise our power in however paradoxical a way in another very important aspect of cultural studies, of identity formation and identity, and playing out a performance of one's identity. Well, thank you so much, and I shall meet you for in the last the last lecture of this module, which is devoted to biology, in the sense that we are trying to now wrap up module 3, which is devoted to sites. We began with the body, and we are also going to end with a similar topic, which is biology. Thank you so much.